This is a Trident Disabilities audio archive recording. From the Public Domain Review, an essay titled The Kept and the Killed by Erica X. Eisen, published January 26, 2022, read by Angela Luttrell. Of the 270,000 photographs commissioned by the U.S. Farm Security Administration to document the Great Depression, more than a third were quote-unquote killed. Erica X. Eisen examines the history behind the hole-punched archive and the unknowable void at its center. We have a photograph that's untitled photograph by Carl Mydans, 1935, possibly depicting a farm in Prince George's County, Maryland, one of the so-called quote-unquote killed negatives that were hole-punched by FSA staff to indicate they should not be printed. And we have a negative picture that has a black hole right in the middle punched, with the very background is trees, and it looks like a sparse farmland. There's barely any grass, mostly dirt that looks like it's damp, and you could see the different ways that the rain has kind of made divots in it. It says, the first killed negative I encountered is of a field. It's a Carl Mydans shot, and a drought has reduced the land to a flat, cracked expanse, out of which only a few tenacious scraggles of crabgrass have managed to sprout. Nothing notable here, no action, no grand geometries, except that the center of the negative has been pierced by a perfect circle, as though in center point to the sprocket holes running along the photo's edge. Briefly, I imagine that this circle is what has doomed the land, a well into which all the precious waters must have run. Months after coming across the photograph, it is that void, more than any peripheral scenery, which remains anchored in my memory, that in the caption describing the picture as quote-unquote killed. Begun as part of the alphabet soup of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies, the Farm Security Administration, FSA, under the aegis of which Mydans' ill-fated photo was taken, had been tasked with resettling struggling farmers onto more fertile ground, providing education about agricultural science, and giving loans for the purchase of land, feed, and livestock. Arguably, its most enduring legacy today, however, is the hundreds of thousands of photographs the agency produced to document the plight of destitute farmers, many of whom were trapped in an inescapable pit of debt, had made deeper still by the environmental devastation of the Dust Bowl. The project's head, Roy Emerson Stryker, 1893 to 1975, would shop his favorites around, going from newsroom to newsroom, quote, with pictures under his arm, end quote, as Dorothea Lange would later recall in an attempt to secure placements in major papers. Stryker had encyclopedic ambitions, tasked with the mission of introducing America to Americans. The FSA's photography wing would soon see its remit balloon far past images of rural poverty to encompass everything from aerial shots of utopian building projects to Kodachrome still lifes, all of which could find a home within what Stryker called simply the file. Next, we have a photo titled A Log Sheet from the Farm Security Administration, tracking which newspapers and periodicals published Dorothea Lange's migrant mother in the late 1930s. It is titled Migrant Mother and Children. Underneath that has California in capitals, but it has a photograph, black and white, very crystal clear, that has a mother looking off into the distance. She has a child on each side that is facing her back, and they're leaning on each of her shoulders, but she has her elbow propped up on her lap, and instead of her face or chin resting in her hand, she actually has her fingertips resting on the corner of her right side of her lip, and she has very inset eyes. You could tell that maybe she's definitely lived a life. She's got creases on her forehead. She's got just very much maybe age lines, but she still looks young. and all of them have a little bit dirtier clothes, maybe like they just either are homeless or they've gone through a lot, and maybe they're just, kind of going through a depression era. Underneath that, it has a log which says publications which they have appeared, and it has several numbers underneath that. The article continues, yet despite the file's colossal scope, there were still images that Stryker deemed unfit for inclusion. These photographs had to be, in his parlance, quote-unquote killed, marked for exclusion, usually with a merciless hole punch through the middle. By the time the project came to a close, the FSA's photographers had captured some 270,000 images, of which a staggering 100,000 were killed. These include work by pioneering black filmmaker and photographer Gordon Parks, by Russell Lee, who would go on to document the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, by Marion Post Wolcott, the FSA's first full-time female photographer. They also include images of which not even a punctured trace survives. Stryker only used the hole punch method on 35mm negatives. When presented with sheet film, he felt it was unsuitable. He simply discarded it. Stryker's career had a ping-pong trajectory. He dropped out of the Colorado School of Mines to become a rancher before being shipped off to fight in World War I, then returned to the U.S. and studied economics at Columbia. There, he researched utopian socialism with Rexford Tugwell, a professor whose emphasis on the pedagogical and psychological impact of visual aids left an impression on Stryker. After Tugwell became part of Roosevelt's, quote, brain trust, end quote, of key advisors, he called upon his former student to join him in Washington and head up the photography arm of the Resettlement Administration, which in 1937 was folded into the Farm Security Administration. Though not a photographer himself, Stryker nevertheless had a clearly defined sense of the medium as an instrument of social action and knew what he liked and did not like as an image. He would often send his photographers into a field armed with pages-long scripts detailing what exactly he wanted them to capture, itemized lists that sometimes approached aphoristic form, the baseball diamond as an important part of our general landscape, pressed clothes, the wall decorations in homes as an index to the different income groups and their reactions, old tire piles, parenthesis, what will happen to the roadside hamburger stand, close parenthesis, pictures of men, women, and children who appear as if they really believed in the U.S. Next, we have several pictures. The first one is titled, states, Untitled Photograph by John Bacon, 1938, possibly related to a series captioned, quote, Ball Team at Irwinville Farms in Georgia, end quote. It is a negative, black and white, of course, and it has a black perfect hole punch, slightly off center on the right-hand side. We have a baseball player that is right in front of the base. He is in the action of bunting a ball, and he has a catcher where you can see half of the catcher's body behind him to the left-hand side. There's trees and a White House behind him in the distance, and he is on a mound of dirt that's flat, but it's mostly dirt, and it has a little bit of sparse grass behind him. Next, we have a photograph described as Untitled Photograph by Theodore Jung, 1936, of the, quote, interior of rehabilitation client's cabin, end quote, in Jackson, Ohio. This one we see 3/4 of a bed, so we see directly in front of us the corner of the bed touching the corner of a room, so two sides of the bed are touching the wall. And the wall is actually wallpapered in newspaper. There's two white pillows at where the headboard would be, and there is looks like a perfect white glass doll that has a striped dress on. She has a little bonnet and white shoes. She's sitting up on a quilt that covers the bed and is perfectly made. We look like it might have a cat to the doll's right, but the black punch dot is literally at maybe where the head of the animal would be, which is slightly off center to the left. The next photograph is titled Untitled Photograph by Carl Meidens, 1935, of, quote, meat testing, end quote, in Prince George's County, Maryland. We have several people sitting at a table, 5 people, and we are pretty much the 6th person at the table. Everybody else is sitting in front of us, 2 to the left and 2 to the right. They all have plates, looks like forks in hand, and water glasses, and they are blindfolded with white blindfolds that go from their nose all the way up to the very top of their forehead. And looks like 1 or 2 are women on the right side. Everyone else looks maybe to be male, and they're all wearing dark colored clothes. The men have ties, and they're in a white room, so maybe a cafeteria or a doctor's location. The article continues, Stryker's editorial philosophy occasionally brought him into conflict with the photographers he employed. His refusal to use the captions Lange painstakingly composed for her own images greatly frustrated her. Despite praising Migrant Mother as the pinnacle of her FSA photography program's output, Stryker would fire Lange on 3 separate occasions, close parenthesis. Photographer Edwin Roskam remarked bitterly that Stryker's hole-punching habit, quote, was barbaric to me. I'm sure that some very significant pictures have in that way been killed off because there's no way of telling, no way what photograph would come alive when, end quote. Another FSA staffer, Ben Shan, referred to Stryker's style as, quote, a little bit dictatorial, end quote. It continues in italics. He ruined quite a number of my pictures, ... Some of them were incredibly valuable. He didn't understand at the time, ... Later on, during the war, ... I went to look for a negative, and he'd punch a hole right through it. Well, I shot my mouth off about that, but I didn't know what was done with a lot of my negatives naturally. He learned then not to do that, you see, because this was an invaluable document of what life was like in 1935, and when I was looking for it in 1943 or 44, it didn't exist anymore. Then it continues again, no more italics. A chastened Stryker eventually granted veto power to the photographers over which of their images would be killed. By the time he took a job at the Pittsburgh Photography Library in the 1950s, Stryker had transitioned to indicating killed negatives by having them pasted onto cards marked with an incongruously cutesy blue star. Sometimes, however, the old temptation for more abrasive methods seemed to take hold. Other cards were branded by a special kill stamp. In still other cases, the destroying angel seems to have taken Stryker over completely and caused him to slash across the doomed images in marker. Even those pictures that he favored were not immune from these kinds of interventions. Squiggles, lines, and written notes instructed his employees to crop and straighten. Addenda that sometimes smudged or marred the photo Stryker was trying to perfect. Next, we have a photograph that states, Beaumont Newhall's photograph of Roy Stryker, far right, reviewing photographs with Russell Lee, Arthur Ronstein, and John Bacon, leftmost, circa 1938. It's a photograph where we have 4 men, 3 to the far rightmost, gathered closer. The one on the far left, which was John Bacon. But they're all looking at one photograph together, where one gentleman has it in his hand. Most of them are actually all smiling. 2 of them have glasses on. 2 of them have similar hairdos where It's a little bit slight curled, and the other ones are more slicked back. 3 of them have ties on. One has a bow tie, but they all have jackets and button-up underneath vests. And on the table in front of them, where the picture that they're looking at is not in the air in their hands, they have a large stack of photographs that look like they're on cardstock. The next photograph states, untitled photograph by Theodore Jung, 1935, possibly related to a series captioned, quote, farmland, hillside type, thoroughly worked, Garrett County, Maryland, end quote. This one has a black hole punch directly in the middle. It also has a marker. It appears white because the picture is black and white, but it has an X, and it's a little bit transparent, like you would see a highlighter or something come through as if it were scratched, or again, partially transparent. And we can fully see well that the picture or the negative is of farming land, where they actually have the small mini teepee haystacks sporadically throughout the field. And then as we look farther in the distance, we can see larger trees, and it slightly get a little bit more hilly. But the actual haystacks and the consistency of the cut ground remains. The article continues, most of the negatives, Stryker killed, by all accounts, were redundancies nixed in favor of a similar image with stronger composition, clearer focus, and facial expressions better comporting with the themes of suffering and endurance he sought to draw out of the FSA's subjects. Shot through, these unloved alternates have become almost more interesting than their perfect twins. In contrast to the carefully captioned file images, killed negatives have no names attached, often no notes on provenance. What little we know about them is only by analogy to those photos that were saved, clues about location gleaned from landscapes, clothing, faces. As such, the killed photos demand a more active viewer, one willing to piece together, to parse, to consign some things to the realm of the curious and unknowable. Did Stryker give much thought as to where to put the hole through when he made his killings? These voids obliterate the hand of a little boy in fringed gloves who stares back calmly at his shooter. They slice through the pavement of an unnamed street where the pair of identical twins walk unawares. They run like sniper's bullets through the legs of a man bending over to pick up fruit. Whiz past the ear of a cop. A black hole tarnishes the pale lapel of a floppy bonneted woman as she looks the other way. It hovers over a man's head like a grim fate narrowly avoided. In one rare example, a vicious flurry of perforations strafes an entire family of Arkansas sharecroppers as the mother tends to her youngest. The void slates houses for destruction, theaters, water pumps, a cotton bale straining at the corset of its ties. It hangs aloft and lightless over a Choctawinity field like a sun negated. The same person is killed and killed again, from one picture to the next. When one views these photos as a series, the whole begins to feel like a vengeful god, too terrible to figure. Once capturing social history, these images now seem to conjure that moment just prior to disaster, before the hole shatters the glass, pops the tire, forces the horse to give one final whinny, kick out uselessly, and fall to the earth. There's a few extra photos that are next. The first one is titled Untitled Photograph by John Bacon, 1938, taken on Roanoke Farms, Enfield, North Carolina. It is a negative where there's a gentleman in a suit with a hat in his hand. He's bent down, and his hat in his hand is reaching the ground in front of him, where you can see that between his legs. His legs are as far apart as his hips, and he is almost in a field of some sparse sticks. Maybe it was a crop field that is no more, and there's just the sticks that are remaining. Maybe it was cotton that's already picked. But he appears to be picking something with his right hand. And in the distance, we can see an older vehicle parked on the road. The next photograph states, untitled photograph by Arthur Rothstein, 1935, related to a series of images captioned, quote, sharecropper's wife and children, Arkansas, end quote. This one has 4 vertical black hole punches on the right-hand side off to the center, where we see on the negative a bed that the youngest of 3 children in the photograph are pictured. It's a white wrought iron bed, and behind the bed we see a window and shiplap wood of the inside of the house. The mother is leaning over the child, and she's looking directly at the child, whereas the 2 children are at the foot of the bed. One is immediately in front of the camera, looking off to their left. The one behind that child is looking directly at the camera. And the mother has her hair half up with wispy ends down, and she's got a plaid light dress on, like she's been working all day. The next photograph is entitled photograph, unknown photographer and date. This one is a child with blonde hair, maybe less than 4 or 5 years old. Dirty as could be, probably playing all day, where he has dirt in his hands. He's got dirt on the front of his outfit. Looks to be walking around barefoot. And he is coming from a path directly behind him, which leads directly to the photographer. And on each side, left and right, there are some wildflowers and a little bit of grass mixed in with dirt. And he's looking questionably at the photographer, and he has furrowed brows and eyes and mud and dirt on his face. And he's got little overall shorts. The next photograph is described as a negative and positive view of an untitled photograph by Carl Meidens, 1935, possibly related to a series of images captioned, quote, transients clearing land, Prince George's County, Maryland, end quote. And it has on the left side the positive, on the right side the negative, where the one on the left, all of the lights are dark. The one on the right, the darks are light, which would be the normal photograph that you would typically see. On the right-hand side, we see the normal negative where the black hole is punched almost exactly in the middle, slightly up and to the right. And we have in the foreground about 5 gentlemen. Only one of them, the one in the front left where we're looking at, is looking at us. They look to be working to loosen the dirt to prepare the ground for sowing and farming. If we look farther behind them, we can still see about an additional 2 to 4 men, and even farther behind that, another 2 or 4 men. It gets smaller and smaller, and we can see some large trees far, far in the distance, but there's not a cloud in the sky. It's completely clear. The one on the left-hand side is the same. It's just completely opposite. So all of the clear sky that is light is completely almost black, and all of the gentlemen are all wearing hats, so their hats all appear as white hats, and any dark skin appears as light skin. Dark outfits appear as light outfits. All of them are wearing overalls. Some of them are wearing pants with just the shirt, and they all have either shovels or hoes. The next photograph is described as an untitled photograph, unknown photographer and date. This one is a negative that has the hole punched in the middle directly over someone who appears to be laying under a blanket on a bed. they're at 90 degrees on a bed. So instead of laying the length of it, they're actually laying on the short end of the bed where your feet would lay. This appears to maybe be a nursing home or a place where someone may go to be taken care of. A lady is sitting at the foot of the bed. She has a quilt on her lap, and she looks to just maybe be staring off into the distance. She's got a light shirt on, short hair. There's one picture on the wall in the background that looks to have a girl and maybe an animal at her side. Otherwise, the wall is white. The ground, though I assume that it's probably tile, looks to be in a design of a rug. In the forefront on the right-hand side, there's a chair facing the lady who's sitting in a chair. And between them, the chair and the lady in the chair, is a wood-burning stove on the right-hand side. The article continues, punning on the pinhole history of early photographic technologies like the camera obscura. Roland Barthes used the word punctum, open parentheses, sting, spack, cut, little, hole, close parentheses, to name the disarming effect of certain images. A quote, photograph's punctum, end quote, he wrote, quote, is that accident which pricks me, parenthesis, but also bruises me, is poignant to me, close parentheses, end quote. In the killed negatives, we find Barthes' dictum literalized. It is the little hole or holes themselves that arrest our eyes and imagination. The strange contradiction at the heart of the killed negatives, as the very existence of this essay attests, is that in an important sense they weren't killed. The hole-punched photos remain in the Library of Congress. Preserved by Stryker himself, and the Pittsburgh Photography Library images deemed unfit for the archives have instead come to comprise their own separate archive in the same building, a sort of salon de refus. Ellen Benson writes that the quote-unquote atonement of these images, quote, produces a contradictory effect, a desire to look, to open the killed storage boxes and inspect the remains, end quote. When we do look, we find that whatever the organic center of the original photo's gravity may be, the void has usurped it and become suddenly the focal point. In the subtle but unmistakable way that Stryker's puncture marks reveal the three-dimensional negative form which each two-dimensional image is printed, they call our attention to the fact that the photograph is a physical object and a fragile one at that. And yet at the same time, it's difficult not to feel a visceral real as a hole slices through the head of a child, the face of a young mother. Stryker's rejects present us with the push-pull of mimesis. The scenes become less real, even as they become more emotionally immediate. A couple pictures are next. The first is described untitled photograph by Carl Meigens, 1936, of homesteaders' children in Pandarilla, North Carolina. It's a negative that has two young children that are just in their diapers, cloth diapers, with their feet in a puddle in a surrounding grass area. The black punch hole is on the bottom left of center that covers one of the two children's face. The child's face that is not covered is squinting because it appears to be sunny and facing the photographer. Behind them, they have, after the grassy area, a tree to the left, but then a sandy area in front of the house that's in the background. They appear to be in maybe a beachy area of North Carolina. They have almost like pine trees or like a coastal kind of home. The next photograph is titled Untitled Photograph by Russell Lee, 1937, of a, quote, young Indian mother and baby, end quote, at Blueberry Camp near Little Fork, Minnesota. The black punch hole is through the very center of the photograph that is covering the majority of the mother's face. She has dark hair and appears to, we could barely tell, but she possibly had a small headpiece. She has a serious face, and she is holding the infant little girl who is looking at the photographer in her lap with her fingers intertwined. And she has a dark and light vertical striped dress on. And she is in the forefront open area of what appears to be a forest, because we could tell that there's tons of trees behind her, and she's in a shaded area. The article continues, if we wish to examine what images Stryker thought ultimately worthy of keeping, we must also consider the question of what images he thought were worth taking in the first place. Groups like Latinos and Native Americans, for instance, are underrepresented in the file. In a 1937 letter to Lange, while she was on assignment photographing tenant farmers in Texas, Stryker advised her to, quote, take both black and white, but place the emphasis on the white tenants, since we know that these will receive much wider use, end quote. That later part was indeed borne out by the fact that the exhibitions and newspapers more readily selected white images from the file than non-white. More broadly, the FSA's focus on the Madonna, the Stoic striver, elevated a certain class of, quote, deserving poor, end quote, above those who were beyond the bounds of both of being photographed and receiving material aid. For the government, of course, these two things were tightly interwoven. The purpose of the FSA's photography program, after all, was to drum up support for the New Deal among an American public that had long viewed poverty as a moral strain. In the course of resettling white tenant farmers in the Mississippi Delta, the FSA forcibly uprooted black families throughout the region. Families whose suffering, it appears, did not rate high enough to make it into the file. When I viewed Stryker's negatives together, they seemed to be posing questions not just about the work of the FSA, but about the future of the country they sought to document. Both, quote, who should get a farm loan, and who cuts a heroic enough figure to advertise them, end quote. Not only, quote, whose grief do we recognize, end quote, but also, quote, whose grief is deserving to succor, end quote. Who will be kept and who will be killed? Who will survive in America? And what image of this land will these survivors bear into the future?